PlayStation 5 is upon us. Sony has actually been pretty darn mum about the PlayStation 5, taking their sweet time to reveal the darn thing, and they haven't really said a lot since. However, luckily, all that's changing and we finally have the answers to the most burning questions. But what are the details? What do I get? How do I get my hands on it? And for how much? Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, let's talk about the difference between PlayStation 5's disc and digital versions, their specs, and the graphics. So the release date for PlayStation 5 is as such. In the US, Japan, Canada, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea, it's coming November 12th, and the rest of the world is getting it on November 19th. Now this nearly coincides with the Xbox launch on the 10th, so it's going to be interesting to see which launch gets more attention, or if they're going to kind of bleed together and end up all kind of being one event. I can't tell you one way or the other, but I can tell you that during the event in which they announced all of this information, we got a pretty intense amount of information. And while we definitely will be talking about things like Final Fantasy XVI's exclusivity at some other time, outside of specs and release date stuff, what I really want to bring up here is the new PlayStation Plus collection. Now, as we know, Microsoft has this thing called the Game Pass, which continually gives you access to new games. However, what we're getting with this new PlayStation Plus collection is a sort of expansion on the PlayStation Plus subscription service, which is going to give you a big collection of hits from the PlayStation 4 era. Like, you get some of the first party stuff like God of War, Uncharted 4, A Thief's End, and Bloodborne, but you also get some third party games like Final Fantasy 15 and Resident Evil 7. This is of course not the full extent of the games, but it is a good lineup. It doesn't come at any additional charge, which is great. You basically just have games if you have PlayStation Plus, and I like that a lot. Game prices are actually going up. Sony actually decided they're going to price their worldwide studios titles between $49.99, which is $10 less than the normal we see, but also all the way up to $69.99, which is $70. And people complain about $60 games now. I could see this being maybe a bit of an issue, but I mean, this is also kind of the only bad news we got. Another next-gen console, another 2 versions. What's the difference here? Now, where Microsoft went ahead and created an entry-level version and a, I guess, beefy advanced version, Sony has instead opted to make the primary difference between its 2 price points the disk drive. Now, we knew about the existence of these 2 different versions of the console since back in June when everything was announced. We saw what the console looked like, we saw the new controller. It's not new news. However, I think the interesting thing is that these are essentially identical consoles. The entry level here is not about cutting back on features, it's fully about whether or not you get an optical drive. Now, specifically, the drive that they're packaging with the PlayStation 5, if you do so choose the one with the drive, is a 4K UHD Blu-ray drive. Where the difference between the entry-level Xbox and the full Xbox this generation is vast, the difference between the 2 PlayStation versions is not. It looks pretty much the same, except for one of them is asymmetrical and has a drive on it. I actually think that the digital edition looks significantly better than the one with the drive. However, again, as I said in the Xbox video, that's kind of an important thing in some areas of the country where the internet is, well, not as good, to understate the issue significantly. We are still very much in a situation in which large swaths of the United States is still on dial-up in 2020, yes. So obviously some people are basically stuck with the optical drive. Still, that being the only difference, I think is kind of cool. So let's maybe get into the specs a little bit. Now, one thing we've learned over the years is very much about how specs work. It's not so much raw numbers. Obviously, it matters what numbers you have, but a lot of the time it's more about pipeline, especially with this generation, even though both manufacturers have opted for a pretty big jump in specs. For the CPU, we're talking about 8 Zen 2 cores clocked at 3.5 gigahertz, a variable frequency that, might I add, is a specific process that they've more or less opted into to keep power consumption stable and instead adjusting the clock. The GPU is a custom RDNA 2 that is coming in at 10.28 teraflops, which is and I'm sure a lot of people are going to point this out in the comments and for the next several years, lower than 12, which is the number the Xbox Series X has. Now, just off raw numbers alone, this sounds like a disadvantage. However, we're talking about lots of teraflops for one. 10 is a ton, and so is 12. And two, again, we're talking about the pipeline of how everything goes. It's the path it takes and the speed it travels at, which I think we need to talk about the most significant aspect of the PlayStation 5 being its solid-state drive. This is basically the thing PlayStation 5 is really selling itself on, and I believe it. I'm really, really convinced this is going to be a game-changing feature. Now, I know we're not specifically comparing to Xbox Series X, but if the PlayStation 5 does better, technically speaking, this is why, and I think it bears mentioning. The Xbox Series X has an incredibly fast SSD that transfers data at 2.4 gigabytes per second, uncompressed, 4.8 gigabytes per second compressed. This is lightning fast. I'll provide a little context. Now, in the Xbox One X, there is a hard drive that tops out at 5400 RPM, which, roughly speaking, delivers about 100 megabytes per second. I provide all of this context because the Xbox Series X is incredibly impressive as far as its SD speed, and the PlayStation 5 just eats it for lunch. The NVMe SSD they've got inside the PlayStation 5 does uncompressed data at 5.5 gigabytes per second and compressed data between 8 and 9 gigabytes per second. That's absolutely insane. We're talking about not loading, just literally streaming all content at all time. This very well, like I said, could be the thing that makes the PlayStation 5 matter. This could be the full justification. This could be the selling point. This could, whatever you want to call it. That is breakneck speed, and it very well may create the most comfortable gaming experience on any platform. As far as memory, it has 16 gigabytes of GDDR6, which is clocking in at 448 gigabytes per second. Obviously, the memory is not the bottleneck here. It's the SSD, which is higher than probably most SSDs that you would be able to get on the consumer market. Now, this is where it's interesting, though. We do not have a 1 terabyte SSD in this machine. It is 825 gigabytes, which is roughly 175 gigabytes shy of that terabyte, which the competition has. Now, this one does have an expandable storage slot for another SSD, as well as the ability to store things on USB hard drives, however, not necessarily to play games off of them. Essentially, the thing that they're trying to sell with the PlayStation 5 is a machine that can play games without load screens and allow for developers to do some pretty interesting things, like seamless teleporting. We also know that all consoles of this new generation are going to be capable of ray tracing. That's of course great, but there's really genuinely not any tech differences between the standard and digital editions of the PlayStation 5. Now, in terms of performance, the boon is of course the memory, but in terms of sales, I do think PlayStation 5 has played it really smart. Now, with the new Xboxes, the entry-level one is not the same console as the main one. It's actually a pared-down version that will be capable of less. That is not the case with the PlayStation 5, and it is reflected in the pricing, where the primary console is coming in at $499, just like the Xbox Series X, and the digital edition is coming in at $399, which is actually $100 more than the Xbox Series S, which comes in at $299. However, we have one distinct advantage here, in that the digital edition is the same console just without an optical drive. So, in theory, that optical drive, which, I mean, if you live in an area that has good internet, you're not going to need. That shaves a full $100 off the price of the mainline console. That's a big advantage over Microsoft if you ask me. Now, I could be wrong, of course, and I'm kind of just speculating based on these two things, but there's a tech thing and a price thing that both, I think, give the console a pretty distinct advantage. And remember, I was one of the people telling you the Switch was going to be a huge hit when everybody was calling it stupid. Do you remember way back when? Now, I'm sure Sony fans were vaguely worried when a purported leak happened with Bloomberg, where some sources said Sony had reduced its manufacturing plans by 4 million units due to a complication in development. Fortunately, Sony squashed that rumor pretty quick, and everything seems to be being shipped at the numbers that were originally targeted. So what do you think? Are you getting a PlayStation 5? Which one? Leave us a comment, let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. The best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. So click subscribe. Don't forget to enable all notifications. And as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero. And we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.